Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Guldan is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 10 most popular cards in Hearthstone in the Kobolds and Catacombs era. I recently asked my community to name their favorites and least favorite Hearthstone cards, and this video is going to contain the 10 cards that were named the most often, with the very most popular, the card that people like the most, at the number 1 spot. So let's go ahead and jump into this list, starting off with number 10. And it's King's Bane, the rogue legendary weapon from Kobolds and Catacombs, at the number 10 spot. Now this is going to start a theme which I think you'll see carry on throughout the video, and that's that people really like control style cards that offer some sort of inevitability to the game, where if you get this thing established and you play it, you're probably going to have a good chance to stabilize and win. And King's Bane, of course, captures that philosophy perfectly with all the buffs it can get, and particularly Leeching Poison giving you so much heal, and the mill rogue style of play that it tends to encourage. Usually if you get that late game Kingsbane running, it's just impossible for your opponent to actually do anything, and you're eventually going to win through fatigue. And even though decks that run Kingsbane don't have the highest win rate, particularly in standard format right now, clearly people are still enjoying playing this card, and the fact that it just never dies and it keeps coming back and it retains its buffs, I can see why that's so much fun and so easy to love, so I'm not particularly surprised to see this one on the list. Moving on to the number 9 spot here, we have Deathwing. Now this one was a little bit more surprising for me, just because Deathwing's not a card you normally see in standard format constructed Hearthstone. It's very rarely ever played. Occasionally you'll see it come out of a Dragon Generator card, like Netherspite Historian, for instance, and maybe occasionally you'll see it in some kind of big Dragon Druid, but that's an incredibly uncommon occurrence on the ladder today. So why is Deathwing so popular? And I think that's really just because if you think about like big, bomb, like crazy recognizable, iconic cards in Hearthstone, I guess Deathwing is sort of at the top of the pile, right? He's the biggest dragon in the classic set. He's probably a card people get exposed to and they're just like, whoa, that was crazy, that was awesome. When you look through that collection manager for the first time, he's kind of at the end there is like the big centerpiece. The art looks just perfectly iconic and everything about it's like symmetrical and cool, and he's just a giant dragon. Of course, a super famous World of Warcraft character, villain as well. So I think a lot of stuff to just love and attach to it with Deathwing, the kind of character people just identify with, and they immediately say, wow, that is an awesome looking card. That's sort of the epitome of crazy stuff in Hearthstone, at least as a new player, particularly in the classic set. So I think probably for a lot of people, Deathwing is one of the first cards they either crafted or got in a pack, so it just tends to stand out in their memories and remains one of those beloved cards. So moving on to the number 8 spot here, we have Frostless Jaina, and once again, this is another big late game control card that if you get it established early enough, is probably just going to win you the game on raw value, generating endless, or at least seemingly endless, water elementals. Now, again, Frostless Jaina doesn't actually see that much play on the ranked ladder right now. I mean, there is sort of a big spell or control style mage that pops up from time to time, but she doesn't make the cut in the more traditional, super fast secret mage list. So it's not like everybody's playing Frostless Jaina. I think people just really like the idea of that super stabilized, really defensive mindset in Frostless Jaina because of the lifesteal she provides, and of course, just summoning dudes all the time, big water elemental dudes, in fact, makes her a lot of fun to play. She just offers that same sort of inevitability and late game stabilization that feels so rewarding when you finally stop your opponent in their tracks and you start to swing things in your favor. That's such a good way to feel and play Hearthstone. And of course, Frostless Jaina will not be the last Death Knight on this list. Death Knight hero cards in general seem pretty popular among the community, despite the fact that they're from the last expansion. It doesn't look like Kobolds and Catacombs cards have stood out quite as much as the Death Knights. People still, despite this being Kobolds and Catacombs, like the Death Knights a little bit more. So moving on to the next spot here, we have Reno Jackson. And talking about stabilizing and control cards, of course, Reno is the epitome of that, absolutely. There's nothing like landing that turn 6 Reno heal, completely shutting out your opponent's aggro hopes and dreams, forcing them to concede immediately. Even sometimes if you're in a control v control matchup, playing Reno can still feel so rewarding, just to know that you've got that extra time and that luxury. Drawing Reno is often one of the best feelings in Hearthstone too, so it's no surprise at all that people associate some really good times here with Reno Jackson. And despite the fact that he's wild format exclusive right now, not playable in standard format at all anymore, he still is popular enough to make the list, even though I think most of my community, and in fact most of the people who responded, are probably much more biased towards standard format in their play. They still have such fond memories of Reno Jackson, and perhaps there were just enough wild players out there who think this is the absolute end-all be-all of cards that he still makes the cut, and in fact ranks not even near the bottom of the list, more towards the middle of the list. So congrats, Reno Jackson. Despite your time in the sun already being passed, you're still a completely beloved and one of the most popular cards in the game. So moving on to the number 6 spot here, we really have what I would say is the only sort of aggro card, or really even aggressively minded non-control style card in this entire list, with Leroy Jenkins. Apparently there are just enough people out there who like to smork really, really hard and just outright run over their opponents that Leroy still found a spot on this list amongst basically 9 other control style cards. Leroy is the one lone standout, and it also feels really good to play Leroy, because when you're playing Leroy, you're generally winning the game, because you play him to secure lethal. You play him with other combo cards, all the Cold Bloods and stuff of the world, to help kill your opponent. And I guess technically Leroy has been played in some control decks in the past as a combo finisher. Even Miracle Rogue, you could argue, isn't an aggro deck by any means, and it's been played in that. Things like Warlock in the past has run it with Faceless Manipulators and Power Overwhelmings. There are some ways to squeeze this card into multiple archetypes, but still, I think stands out as that staple finisher for faster decks, and I think that is why most people really do attach to Leroy. And of course, a great moment in World of Warcraft history with the Leroy Jenkins video that inspired this card. Great sound effects, voice lines, etc. So Leroy's a lot of fun to play. Clearly a deserving card on this list. One of the most played and arguably popular from that standpoint of like how much it's been played in the history of Hearthstone cards in the entire game. So a card that you see a lot, sometimes you hate to lose to, but also sometimes you love to win with. So now moving into the top 5 here, we have Yogg Sauron, Hope's End. And this one's clearly just on the list because it's like the ultimate super fun meme style card. Yogg Sauron hasn't been competitive in a very long time, although it was initially, just because it gave you that sort of last out Hail Mary style of play where you could win a game from nothing, and that was a terrible thing for Hearthstone's health as far as I'm concerned. Like, that was a miserable way to lose. But since they've nerfed Yogg Sauron a little bit, pulled him back, he doesn't see nearly as much play anymore, and that makes him a fun kind of just chaotic card instead of a frustrating to lose to competitive card. And to me too, that's made Yogg Sauron go from one of my least favorite cards in the game to one of my most favorite cards in the game. I'm really going to miss Yogg Sauron when he rotates out of standard format, because it's still fun to just drop that Yogg and see what happens. Sometimes it backfires miserably. Occasionally it can still win you games to this day, and that's so much fun to just put it all up to RNGesus himself, see what happens, and just let Yogg Sauron dictate the course of your fate. That's a great experience in Hearthstone. Not the most competitive experience, certainly. Can be frustrating, but so much fun if you're playing for more of a casual or meme style that I think Yogg Sauron is a fitting honoree on this list. And up next to the number 4 spot here, we have Ragnaros, the Fire Lord, a card that I think is on this list for a lot of the same reasons that Deathwing is on this list, despite the fact that Ragnaros is wild format exclusive, and as I mentioned, most of the people naming their cards for this list are standard format players. He still made the cut, and in fact even made it into the top 4. That's completely crazy. How does Ragnaros rank so highly among standard format Hearthstone players? Well, I can tell you, because people have so many fond memories of this card. I mean, even for me, this is a card that holds so much nostalgia. I can remember the first time I got Ragnaros played against me. I thought it was absurd. The first time I played a Ragnaros, I felt like I was just the king of the world, because it was always kind of a joke for me, like everybody has Ragnaros and I don't have Ragnaros. And then the first day I finally got Ragnaros many years ago in Hearthstone's history, I just felt like I had conquered the game. I finally had my awesome, big, great, competitive legendary. And that's so nostalgic. Not to mention that, of course, for me, the first time I beat Ragnaros in World of Warcraft, it was a server-first raid way back in Vanilla WoW. I was like over the moon, right? Because nobody on our server had done it yet. We were a top-end raiding guild, and that's one of my fondest gaming memories, if not my fondest gaming memories. So for me, Ragnaros carries a ton of nostalgic weight. He's just amazing. And I think that's the case for a lot of other people too, even if they don't have that World of Warcraft experience. Just in Hearthstone, this card is just so rich and flavorful and iconic. It's one of the best legendaries that Hearthstone has ever had. So clearly a deserving spot on this list. So now let's move into the top 3 here, starting off with Deathstalker Rexar. And another Death Knight, and in fact, not even the last Death Knight on this list, so no surprise here to see Rexar. This card is just perfect. It's so much fun. I have to say Deathstalker Rexar probably ranks in my personal top 3 as well, simply because the Build-A-Beast mechanic is just so fun. It's so interesting and interactive, and it requires a ton of strategy and thought and consideration. And despite how interesting it is from a mechanic and gameplay standpoint, on top of that, it's just super cool to build 2 beasts and stitch them together and see what your results end up with. That's so nifty. Not to mention, this is another one of those cards that's a very control style card that once you play it, you feel like you can really start to stabilize, and it provides some sort of infinite value because you're generating some giant threats every single turn and trying to counter whatever your opponent does using some just sort of discover options. That's perfect. That's exactly the kind of experience I love in Hearthstone. And that's, I think, the case for a lot of people. Build-A-Beast is so much fun. Rexar is awesome. Hunter, not necessarily the most popular class all the time since Rexar has come out. More of a fringe competitive deck. And that probably even helps Rexar a little bit because it's not so frustrating to play against. It's one of those more random, just obscure moments that happens occasionally that really brings a smile to your face and makes Hearthstone a lot more fun. Even if you're playing against it, Rexar can still be enjoyable to see what your opponent tries to figure out. And of course, playing it yourself, tons of fun. One of the best experiences in the game. So a very clear and obvious inclusion for the top 3. And now moving on to the number 2 spot is a card that completely stunned me. I had no idea people loved Ren the First Disciple quite so much. And I guess I've been completely wrong about this card in every imaginable way. I thought it would be a terrible card in a competitive sense. Now, I always thought it would be fun and interesting because there is that just harrowing and horrific inevitability of your opponent getting the demons and knowing that Azari is coming and that it's gonna destroy your deck if you can't deal with it. That is such a cool experience. Like, it tells a perfect story. It's just like there's an impending sense of doom. Perfect for Warlock. Great thematically. It's a perfect fantasy for any kind of card design. Blizzard nailed it from that standpoint. And I think that's what people are identifying with. It's just so much fun to put that on your opponent when you're playing Ren, knowing that you've got some sort of ultimate win condition. Now, clearly, sometimes Ren doesn't work out. Sometimes your Skull of Minari will pull your Azari and you don't get to destroy their deck. Sometimes the game's so long that destroying their deck doesn't really help all that much anyway. But even then, there's just that giant pile of stats that Ren provides you with. You get so many different minions onto the board. There's demon synergies to consider resummoning those minions with Guldan. Even this thing itself has Death Rattle, so you can get it back from N'Zoth as well. Ren the First Disciple just fits so well in that control Warlock environment that I think people love it, and they like the idea of trying to accomplish this sort of long-term goal of playing Azari. So a card that obviously way more people than I ever expected absolutely adore because it took the number 2 spot. Ren beat Rexar. It beat Ragnaros. I can't believe Ren is this popular, but here we go. Ren the First Disciple, the second most popular card in Hearthstone according to my community. That's a pretty crazy honor. But it's not the number 1 card, although they're awfully similar because this is another Warlock card. It is a Death Knight, of course. It is Blood Reaver Guldan. There's really no surprise here at all to me that this is the card that people right now like the most because I think a ton of people are playing Q blocks or just control Warlocks, of which, of course, Blood Reaver Guldan is sort of the centerpiece. And often when you're playing Blood Reaver Guldan, that means you're generally winning games. And any card that wins you games is super fun to play, is thematically awesome. With a card like this one has a fantastic hero power, has tons of control potential, has that same sense of inevitability that so many cards on this list we've talked about. Those kinds of cards are perfect, and Guldan, of course, basically encompasses all of those different elements. He's even got some nostalgic value, of course, because it's Guldan, a classic World of Warcraft character. Everything about this one just adds up into exactly the kind of card you would expect people to adore, and since it's so popular in the meta right now, really the most played card, or the most dominant card, I would say, in Hearthstone today, for a class card in particular, no surprise at all. Blood Reaver Guldan, the most popular, the most beloved, people's most favorite card in Hearthstone in the Kobolds and Catacombs era. And there you have it, folks, the 10 most popular cards in the game. Some surprises on there, some wild cards I wasn't expecting to see. A lot of Death Knights made sense. All in all, pretty interesting list. Ren the First Disciple being the real highlight for me personally. That said, I'm curious what you guys have to say. What cards surprised you? Which ones did you identify with on this list? Which ones do you hate on this list? Share your take in the comments below. I'm really curious what you have to say. But until then, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.